Before we begin, make yourself comfortable, maybe grab a drink, dim the lights, and settle in. If you enjoy stories that stay with you after a long day, feel free to like this video and subscribe. And as the story unfolds, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Now, let me tell you a story.
My husband told me not to touch him.
Naomi Esposito got married on an ordinary Tuesday. The dress was white, the church was full, traditional vows, but there was no passionate kiss. There would be no romantic honeymoon, because the marriage wasn't about love, it was business, an alliance between the Esposito and Bianchi families. And her husband, Lucian Bianchi, powerful Don, the coldest and harshest man she knew, made it very clear, before the wedding night, when she tried to touch him, he said, "Never touch me, not here, not in public. This is business, not love." And Naomi's heart, it broke right there, before the marriage had even truly begun. Hi, my name is Lena, the owner of this channel, and today I came to thank Nicola and Jackie for their comments. And I also came to thank all the members of our channel, who are a fundamental support in the continuity of this project that I love so much. And now let me ask you a question. Can true love be born from a bet? Tell me here in the comments, and who knows, you might be the next one to appear at the beginning of the video. Chapter 1: Forced Marriage and Cruel Rules.
This is only business.
3 months before I became Lucian Bianchi's wife, I was sitting in that suffocating room, listening to my father negotiate my life as if it were just another business contract. The meeting was taking place in the Bianchi family office, a place that smelled of expensive leather and power consolidated over generations, and I was there like a decorative piece that no one expected to speak. My father, Don Esposito, was at the table with the other men in the family, and on the other side was him, Lucian Bianchi, the man who would become my husband without ever asking me if I wanted this. He was 34 years old, eyes dark as a starless night, and a posture that made anyone feel small just by being in the same room as him. Since taking over at 25, after his father's death, Lucian had become the most feared and respected Don in the entire region, and now he would be my husband. "The alliance is necessary," my father said, with that voice that allowed no discussion, the same one I'd heard since childhood, whenever he made decisions about territories, business, and apparently about me too. It benefits both families, territories, business, protection. Everything we need is in this agreement. Lucian only tilted his head slightly, fingers interlaced on the polished mahogany table, the posture of someone accustomed to closing million-dollar deals before breakfast. "I agree," he said, and his voice was deep, controlled, cold as ice in the dead of winter. "What are the terms?" I felt my stomach turn when my father responded, as if he were delivering a shipment of merchandise and not his own daughter. "Marriage. My daughter Naomi and you. Unite the families officially." Lucian didn't even blink, showed no surprise or hesitation, nothing beyond that mask of absolute control that seemed to be part of his face. "I accept." "When?" 3 months, my father replied, satisfied with the ease of the negotiation. "Enough time to prepare everything." "Sufficient," Lucian agreed, and it was at that moment that something inside me finally found a voice, even knowing it would be useless, even knowing that no one there cared what I had to say. "Dad," I said, and my voice came out firmer than I expected, despite the tightness in my chest and the trembling hands hidden under the table. "Don't I have a say in this?" My father looked at me with that expression I knew all too well, the one that said I was being inconvenient and childish. "No, it's for the good of the family, Naomi. You understand. It wasn't a question. It was an order disguised as an explanation, and I knew that arguing would be worse than accepting in silence. So I swallowed the tears that threatened to rise, forced my voice to remain steady, and said what he wanted to hear. "I understand." It was at that moment that I felt the weight of a gaze on me, and when I raised my eyes, I found Lucian watching me for the first time for real. He was studying me with those dark and impenetrable eyes, and for a second I wondered what he saw. A beautiful woman? An obligation? A piece on the chessboard he played with mastery? He said nothing, just held my gaze longer than was comfortable, and I saw something pass through his expression, too fast for me to identify. Then he looked away, returning to the papers in front of him, and I was left there with my heart racing, and the feeling that my life had just changed forever. During the weeks that followed, there were dinners, formal and supervised dinners, where Lucian and I sat across from each other in expensive restaurants, surrounded by discreet security guards, and curious looks from other families who knew exactly what that marriage meant. They were meetings that were supposed to help us get to know each other better, but only served to show me how distant and inaccessible that man really was. Do you like music? Art? I tried at one of those dinners, looking for any crack in the ice armor he wore all the time. Anything that would make me believe there was a human being underneath all that calculated coldness. I don't have time for hobbies, he replied, without even looking up from the wine he was swirling in his glass, as if the question was too irrelevant to deserve his full attention. I took a deep breath, trying again, refusing to give up so easily. What about family? Do you have siblings? This time he looked at me, and there was something dark in that look, something that made my chest tighten, even without me understanding why. No, only child. Mother died, father too. Just me. The way he said it, so direct and devoid of emotion, made me feel an involuntary empathy I didn't want to have for him. I'm sorry, I said, and it was true, because no one deserved to be alone in the world, not even a man who seemed made of marble. It must be lonely. Lucian closed his expression even more, if that was possible, and his voice became even colder when he replied, It's not. Loneliness is efficient, as if life were just a matter of productivity and control, with no room for human warmth or real connection. At that moment, I realized I was about to marry a man who had built walls so high around himself that I doubted anyone could ever scale them. The wedding day came faster than I expected. The church was packed, decorated with white flowers and candles that danced in the dimness, and I was there in my wedding dress, beautiful and delicate, feeling like a fraud. My father gave me away at the altar as if he were fulfilling one more administrative obligation, and Lucian waited for me in that impeccable suit and that expression that revealed absolutely nothing. The priest began the ceremony, and I could barely pay attention to the words, because my heart was beating so hard that I was sure everyone in the church could hear it. When it was time for the vows, the priest's voice echoed through the church with that rehearsed solemnity of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Lucian Bianchi, do you take Naomi Esposito as your wife? I do, he said, and his voice was firm and completely devoid of emotion, as if he were signing a contract and not promising his life to someone. Naomi Esposito, do you take Lucian Bianchi as your husband? I hesitated. It was only a second, but I hesitated, and I felt my father's hand squeeze my arm in a silent warning. Then I forced the words out, even though my voice was shaking in a way I couldn't control. I do. You may kiss the bride, the priest announced, and my heart raced because finally, maybe there would be a real moment between us, something that wasn't rehearsed and cold. But when Lucian leaned in, the kiss was quick and formal, just a touch of lips that didn't last more than 2 seconds. There was no passion, no warmth, nothing but the mechanical fulfillment of a social obligation. My heart sank in my chest as the church applauded, and he offered his arm as mechanically as the kiss. And I accepted with a fake smile plastered on my face for the photos.
I can't do this.
The reception was worse. I was trying to keep up appearances, trying to be the cordial wife everyone expected to see, and in a moment of carelessness, of naturalness I didn't even think twice about, I touched Lucian's arm. It was a light touch, instinctive, the kind of thing a wife would naturally do with her husband. He pulled away. It was discreet enough that people around us didn't notice, but clear enough for me to feel the rejection burn on my skin like a slap. Sorry, I said automatically, feeling my face heat with shame. Lucian leaned in slightly, his voice low enough that only I could hear, and every word that came out of his mouth was like a sharp blade cutting what remained of my hopes. Don't touch me. In public. Appearances are important, but professional distance is too. I looked at him, confused and hurt, searching for some sign that he was joking or testing, but there was nothing but that relentless seriousness. But we're married. It's weird not to touch. You'll get used to it, he said, with a coldness that made my blood run cold, because I don't want anything beyond that. Tears threatened to rise, but I forced them back because I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. Not there. Not in front of all those curious eyes that were already watching and judging us. Night fell, and we finally arrived at the Bianchi mansion, which would now be my home too. I was nervous. My hands were sweating as I followed Lucian through the immense and luxurious hallways, and my heart was beating fast because despite everything, there was still a naive part of me that hoped that maybe, in private, things would be different. He stopped in front of a door and opened it, gesturing for me to enter. This is your room. Mine is in the other hallway. I froze, the words taking a few seconds to make sense in my head. Separate rooms? Yes, he replied as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Privacy for both. But we're married, I said, and my voice came out louder than I intended. disoriented, loaded with all the confusion and hurt I was feeling. Isn't it normal to share a room? Lucian looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time since we met, I saw something beyond the impenetrable coldness. There was control there, an iron control over something he refused to show, and his voice became even lower when he finally spoke. "Naomi, I'm going to be direct because I see no point in prolonging this," he said, and each word was carefully chosen, as if he were establishing the rules of a contract. "This marriage is an alliance, business, not love, not romance. You are my wife on paper, for the public to see and believe, but don't expect affection or intimacy. Understood?" My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces right there, and I felt tears burn in my eyes as I processed what he was saying. "You're saying we're never going to be a real couple?" "Exactly," he confirmed without hesitation. "We maintain appearances in public. Here, we're business partners living together, nothing more." The tears finally fell, and I couldn't hold them back anymore because it was too much. All of it was too much for one person to handle in a single day. What if I want more? Lucian was silent for a moment, and something passed across his face, something that almost looked like regret, but it was too fast for me to be sure. "Then you're going to be disappointed," he said with that coldness that was already becoming familiar and painful at the same time. "I'm not a man of feelings, Naomi. Never have been. I'm not going to start now." He paused, and the silence between us was loaded with everything that wasn't said, with all the hopes I had that were being crushed right there. "Good night, Naomi. Rest." And then he left, leaving me alone in my room on the first night of my marriage, with tears running down my face and the wedding dress that suddenly felt too heavy for me to keep wearing. I slid to the floor, leaning my back against the closed door, and cried like I hadn't cried since childhood, because reality had finally hit me with full force. I had married a man who didn't want me, who never wanted me, who saw our marriage as nothing more than a convenient business transaction. And the worst part of it all was that there was no escape, no way to go back, because in my family, in our world, marriage was forever, no matter how much it hurt. That night, alone and rejected, I realized I would have to find a way to survive this, to build a life alongside a man made of ice who seemed determined to never melt. No one can complain that Lucian isn't honest, unfortunately. Chapter 2: Cold Months and the First Crack.
You are my responsibility.
3 months of marriage, and I had already learned to map Lucian's schedule like it was an exact science. He left at 6 in the morning, when the sun was still rising and the house was plunged in an almost oppressive silence, and only returned at 11 at night, when I was already locked in my room pretending I didn't hear his footsteps echoing through the hallway toward his room, always distant from mine. 18 hours of work per day, 7 days a week, as if being away from home was more comfortable than being close to me. I had established my own routine to survive this marriage that seemed more like a life sentence than anything else. I managed the house, supervised the employees, tried to keep myself busy enough not to think too much about how much my life had transformed into a lonely and empty version of what I imagined it would be. And at some point, almost by accident, I discovered I had a talent for numbers and started helping with his legal business, reviewing contracts and finding inconsistencies that even the most experienced lawyers had missed. Lucian noticed. Of course he noticed, because that man didn't let anything go unnoticed. But he never commented, never thanked, never even acknowledged that I was doing something useful. He just kept sending documents to my office through his secretary, as if I were just another efficient employee, and not the wife he kept miles away emotionally. The dinners, on the rare occasions they happened, were exercises in discomfort and silence. We sat across from each other at the absurdly large dining room table, with food prepared by chefs I didn't even know well, and the only sound was the noise of silverware against expensive porcelain. I had given up trying to make conversation after the 3rd time I received monosyllabic answers, or just head nods, and now I just ate in silence, counting the minutes until I could return to the solitude of my room. But then the flu came, and with it, the first crack in that impenetrable wall Lucian had built between us. It started with mild discomfort, that kind of tiredness you ignore thinking it's just lack of sleep or accumulated stress. But on the 2nd day I had a high fever, shivering under 3 blankets while my body alternated between scalding heat and freezing cold, and my head throbbed with a pain that made even opening my eyes seem like a monumental effort. The maid, Sophia, had come to my room several times offering to call the doctor, but I refused every time because I didn't want to bother anyone, didn't want to seem weak, didn't want to be more trouble than I already was. It was almost midnight when I heard the knock on the door, and in my feverish and confused state, I thought I was imagining things. Nobody knocked on my door at that hour, especially not him, who avoided my hallway as if it were forbidden territory. "Come in," I managed to say with a weak and hoarse voice, barely recognizing the sound that came from my own throat. The door opened and Lucian walked in, still wearing his impeccable suit despite the late hour, but with his tie slightly loosened and sleeves rolled up to his elbows in a way that made something strange happen in my stomach. Even through the fog of fever, he stopped in the middle of the room, looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, and for the first time in 3 months, I saw something beyond the cold and controlled mask he always wore. "You look terrible," he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement loaded with something that almost sounded like concern. "Why didn't you call the doctor?" I was too surprised by his presence there to process the question properly. "I didn't want to bother anyone," I replied, and even to me that sounded pathetic. "It's just the flu." Lucian crossed the room in 3 long and determined strides, and before I could protest or even understand what was happening, he was sitting on the edge of my bed, his large and surprisingly gentle hand touching my forehead. The touch burned, not from the fever, but because it was the first time in 3 months that he had touched me voluntarily, without social obligation or external eyes forcing us to keep up appearances. "You're burning up," he said, and there was a tension in his voice I had never heard before. He grabbed his phone from his pocket with quick and precise movements. "I'm calling Dr. Russo now." "Lucian, you don't need to." I tried to protest, but my voice was so weak that the words came out with no strength at all. He looked at me, and this time there was no coldness in those dark eyes. There was something more intense, something that made my heart race even through the fog of illness. "Yes, I do," he said, and the tone allowed no discussion. "You're my wife, my responsibility. Don't argue." There was a pause, brief but significant, after the word wife, as if he himself was surprised to have used it that way, loaded with a weight that went beyond paper and formality. But before I could think too much about it, he was already talking on the phone with the doctor, his voice returning to that commanding tone he used to close deals and give orders. Dr. Russo arrived in less than half an hour, which said a lot about the power and influence Lucian had. The doctor examined me while Lucian stood near the window, arms crossed and jaw tense, watching every movement with an attention that bordered on obsessive. The diagnosis was a bad flu, nothing serious if treated correctly, but I needed absolute rest, plenty of hydration, and medication to bring down the fever. After the doctor left, leaving a list of prescriptions and detailed instructions, I expected Lucian to leave too, returning to his room and to the safe distance he always kept. But he didn't. He stayed, and when the fever made my pajamas soaked with sweat, it was him who chose clean, dry pajamas from the drawer. It was him who helped me change with surprising gentleness and eyes carefully averted. It was him who brought fresh water and made me take the medicine even when I tried to protest, saying I could do it myself. "Why are you being kind?" I asked at some point, half delirious from the fever, the words coming out without the filter I normally kept. The question hung in the air between us, loaded with all the months of coldness and rejection. Lucian was sitting in the chair next to my bed, sleeves still rolled up and hair slightly messy, in a way that made him look more human, less the untouchable marble statue he always seemed to be. He was silent for so long that I thought he wouldn't answer, but then his voice came, low and almost hesitant. "Because you're sick," he said, as if it were obvious. "And I'm not a monster, Naomi, even if I act like one." There was something in that confession, in that rare moment of vulnerability, that made my heart tighten in my chest in a way that had nothing to do with the flu. But before I could say anything, before I could explore that crack in his armor, sleep pulled me down like an inevitable wave. When I woke up in the morning, sunlight was already coming through the curtains that someone had opened, and my head still hurt, but the fever had gone down considerably. And Lucian was still there, sleeping, sitting in that uncomfortable chair, his head tilted at an angle that would surely make his neck hurt, his suit wrinkled in a way he would never allow if he were awake. He had stayed all night. He had stayed with me, taking care of me, when he could easily have left everything in the employee's hands and returned to the safety of his own room. Something warm and dangerous started to grow in my chest, something I knew I should suffocate before it grew too much, but that I couldn't completely control. "Lucian," I called softly, and my voice was less hoarse than the night before. He woke up immediately, like someone trained to always be alert, and for a second, just a fleeting second, I saw confusion and something like concern in his eyes before the mask returned to place. He stood up quickly, adjusting his suit mechanically, and the discomfort was visible in every movement. "You stayed all night?" I asked, because I needed to hear it from him, needed to confirm I hadn't imagined all of that in feverish delirium. "You had a high fever," he replied, avoiding my gaze while adjusting his shirt cuffs. "Someone needed to monitor." "Thank you," I said, and I put all the feeling that was overflowing in my chest into that single word, "for taking care of me." Lucian finally looked at me, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw something pass through those dark eyes, something that looked like internal war and unresolved conflict. But then he stood up, creating physical distance between us with the urgency of someone who was running from something dangerous. "It was nothing," he said, and his voice was already returning to that cold and controlled tone I knew so well. "You need to get better. I have to go. Work." And without waiting for a response, without giving me time to say anything else, he left the room with quick, almost urgent steps, leaving only the smell of his cologne in the air and a confused Naomi trying to understand what had just happened. In the week that followed, Lucian did something I didn't expect. He avoided me even more than before. If I thought 3 months of cold marriage had been bad, this was worse, because now I knew there was something beyond the coldness. There was a capacity for care and kindness that he hid behind those very high walls he had built around himself. He started working even later, arriving home only after midnight, when he was sure I would already be asleep. And in the rare times we crossed paths in the hallways, he just nodded briefly and went on his way as if I were a stranger. I was in the living room talking to Mabel on the phone, my best friend, and the only person who really understood how much this marriage was slowly and methodically destroying me inside. "He took care of me when I was sick, Mabel," I said, still processing that surreal night. "He was human, you know, kind and worried too. But after, he just disappeared. He's colder than ever." "I don't understand." On the other end of the line, Mabel sighed in that way that meant she was going to give me a hard but necessary truth. "He's scared, girl, of what he felt. Men like that, when they feel something real, they run, because feeling is scarier than any risky business or dangerous situation." "But how long is he going to run?" I asked, and the exhaustion in my voice was impossible to hide. 3 months already felt like an eternity, and the prospect of years, decades like this, was suffocating. "Until something forces him to stop," Mabel replied with that practical wisdom of hers. And then, after a significant pause, she added, "And girl, you can't wait forever. You need to live your life. You can't stay trapped waiting for him to wake up and realize what he has in front of him." Her words echoed in my head long after we hung up the phone. She was right. I knew she was. I couldn't spend the rest of my life waiting for Lucian Bianchi to decide to let me in, waiting for him to stop running from his own feelings, waiting for crumbs of affection like that night when he took care of me had been. "You're right," I said to the silent phone, more to myself than to Mabel, who had already hung up. "I need to live, even if it's alone, even if he never changes." And it was that decision, made in that moment of accumulated frustration and exhaustion, that would change everything. Because a week later, Marcel would call, and I would decide to go out, decide to laugh, decide to live my life even if my husband preferred to keep me at a distance. And Lucian, that man of ice and absolute control, would discover there was something he couldn't control, something that scared him more than any emotion he tried to repress: jealousy. Chapter 3. Marcel appears, and jealousy begins.
We need to go.
What? Why?
No time to explain. We have to leave now.
All right.
A week after my conversation with Mabel, when I had almost convinced myself that I really needed to start living my life independent of Lucian and his emotional walls, my phone rang displaying a name I hadn't seen in months, and that immediately brought a genuine smile to my face. Marcel, my childhood friend, the person who knew all my embarrassing stories and all my teenage dreams, the man who had been my confidant for years before our lives went different ways. "Nay!" His excited voice exploded through the phone before I could even finish saying hello. "It's been so long. I'm in Rome. Work, you know how it is, but I finally got some free time. Can we have dinner?" His excitement was contagious, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Genuine enthusiasm. A real desire to go out and do something that didn't involve staying alone in that huge mansion waiting for a husband who never came. "Marcel, yes, absolutely. When?" "Tonight," he proposed without hesitation. 8 o'clock? At that Italian restaurant we used to love when we were younger? La Dolce Vita? I didn't even need to think twice. "Perfect. I'll be there for sure." After hanging up the phone, I stood there for a moment, processing the strange and wonderful feeling of having something to look forward to, something that wasn't just another lonely night reading or working on Lucian's documents. Then, for the first time in 3 months of marriage, I went up the stairs to my room with real enthusiasm, ready to get dressed for real, not out of social obligation or appearances, but because I wanted to, because I deserved a good night with a dear friend. I chose a navy blue dress that had always been my favorite, the one that had a perfect fit and made me feel beautiful and confident. I did my makeup more carefully than I had in weeks, making my eyes stand out and my lips in a soft shade of rosy nude. And when I looked in the mirror, for the first time in a long time, I saw something beyond the lonely and rejected wife I had become. I saw the Naomi from before, the woman who knew how to laugh and have fun, who had her own life, and didn't depend on anyone's validation to feel complete. When I came down the stairs, it was already past 7:30, and Sophia, the maid who had always been kinder to me, looked at me with a genuine smile and eyes that sparkled with approval. "You look beautiful, Signora Bianchi," she said. and there was something maternal about that compliment that warmed my heart. "Thank you, Sophia," I replied, picking up the small purse that matched the dress perfectly. "I'm going to dinner with a friend. I don't know what time I'll be back." She nodded, still smiling, and I walked out the front door feeling something I had forgotten was possible to feel. Lightness, as if, at least for a few hours, I could just be myself, without the weight of the arranged marriage and the distant husband pressing down on my shoulders all the time. What I didn't know was that Sophia, in her innocence and established routine, would mention my outing to Lucien when he came home that night, and that simple mention would change everything. Lucien showed up at the mansion around 8:15, earlier than normal, and found Sophia organizing the dining room, even though there was no need since there would be no dinner that night. "The Signora went out," she commented casually, not knowing the effect those words would have. "For dinner, with a friend." Lucien stopped in the middle of the hallway, his work briefcase still in his hand, and his tie already loosened from the long day. "Friend?" he repeated, and there was something strange in the tone of his voice, something Sophia couldn't identify but that was there, growing. "What friend?" "I don't know the name, Signore," Sophia replied, continuing to arrange the sofa cushions without noticing the tension building in the man in front of her. "But she was happy, dressed up, very beautiful, happy, dressed up, beautiful, for another man." The words echoed in Lucien's head in a way he didn't expect, awakening something primitive and uncomfortable that he didn't recognize, something that made his chest tighten and his hands close into involuntary fists. "Does she usually go out?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral and failing miserably. "No, Signore," Sophia replied, finally noticing that something was wrong by the way he was standing there, tense like a rope about to snap. "First time in all these months. That's why I was happy for her." Lucien didn't respond. He stood there for a few more seconds that seemed eternal, processing information that shouldn't matter, feeling things that made no sense to feel for a wife he himself had kept at a deliberate and methodical distance. And then, without saying anything else, he went up to his room, changed clothes with mechanical and quick movements, and left again, driving through the streets of Rome with an uneasiness that grew with each block traveled. Meanwhile, at La Dolce Vita, I was having the best night I'd had in months. Marcel greeted me with a tight hug that lasted a few seconds longer than necessary, the kind of hug only real friends give, full of warmth and familiarity. "You look beautiful," he said, when he finally let me go, holding my shoulders and looking at me with that wide smile that had always been his trademark. "Seriously, marriage has been good to you," I laughed, but it was a laugh loaded with irony and a bit of bitterness I couldn't completely hide. "Oh yes, marriage. Wonderful," I said, with all the sarcasm I could muster, and Marcel, who knew me too well not to notice, immediately frowned. "It's not good?" he asked as we sat at the table he had reserved, a more private corner of the restaurant where we could talk without being constantly interrupted. I sighed, playing with the water glass the waiter had just filled, and decided to be honest because keeping all of that inside was slowly killing me. "It's complicated, Marcel. He's cold, you know. Distant. The marriage is basically loneliness for two. I live with him, but it's like we live on different planets." Marcel extended his hand across the table and held mine, a gesture of pure comfort and true friendship, and his eyes were full of genuine empathy when he spoke. "I'm sorry, Nay. You deserve so much more than that. You've always deserved to be truly loved, not just tolerated." "I know," I admitted, and it was liberating to say that out loud, to acknowledge that I deserved more even when I had been forced to accept less. "But it's what I have, so I'm learning to live with it." I shook my head, pushing away the dark thoughts that threatened to ruin the night. "But enough about me and my depressing marriage. What about you? How are you?" "Work." Marcel's face lit up instantly, and he leaned forward with that contagious excitement he always had. "It's great. The London office is doing very well. The cases are interesting and—" He paused dramatically, his eyes shining mischievously. "I'm engaged." I practically screamed with happiness, not caring about the curious looks from the other tables around us. "Really? To who? Tell me everything." "Luca," Marcel replied, and the name came out loaded with so much love and happiness it was impossible not to smile along. "You remember him? The architect I met at that event 2 years ago? We've been together since then and he finally proposed." "I'm so happy for you," I said, and it was the absolute truth, because if anyone deserved to find true love, it was Marcel, who had always been the most genuine and kind person I knew. "Tell me everything. How was the proposal? When's the wedding? I need all the details." And then we spent the next hour talking animatedly about everything and nothing, laughing at old memories and making plans for his future. And I felt something I hadn't felt in so long I had almost forgotten what it was like. Simple and uncomplicated happiness. At some point, while Marcel was telling a particularly funny story about Luca trying to cook and almost burning down the apartment, I touched his arm in a gesture of pure friendship, laughing so hard my eyes were watering, and it was exactly at that moment that I felt that strange sensation of being watched, that shiver on the back of my neck that makes you look around searching for the source. When my eyes found the restaurant window, my blood ran cold, because there, outside, was Lucian, and the expression on his face was something I had never seen before, something between contained fury and an intensity that made the air around seem electrified and dangerous. Before I could fully process what was happening, he entered the restaurant with determined and controlled steps, but there was a tension in every movement that made it clear that control was hanging by a very thin thread. He crossed the room, completely ignoring the curious looks and the maitres' attempts to approach him, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my heart race, for reasons I didn't want to examine too closely. "Lucian," I said when he reached our table, my voice coming out higher than I intended, mixing surprise and a touch of fear with something that could be excitement, but I refused to name. "What are you doing here?" He didn't even look at Marcel, keeping those dark and stormy eyes fixed on me as if we were the only two people in the entire restaurant. "We need to go," he said, and his voice was ice cold but trembling slightly with an emotion he was clearly fighting to control. "Now." "But I started to protest, because this was absurd. It was invasive. It was everything I didn't expect from a man who barely spoke to me at home. "Now, Naomi," he interrupted, and the tone allowed no discussion. But there was something more beyond the order. There was a desperate urgency that made something in me respond even against my will. Marcel stood up, clearly confused and starting to get irritated with the way this stranger was treating me. "Excuse me, but who are you to come here and—" "Marcel," I interrupted him quickly, putting my hand on his arm in a reassuring gesture, even when my own heart was beating erratically. "He's my husband, Lucian." I paused, looking at Lucian with a mixture of irritation and something more complex. "Lucian, this is Marcel, my childhood friend." Friend. The word hung in the air loaded with meaning, but Lucian just clenched his jaw in a way I was beginning to recognize as a sign that he was holding back something much bigger than he wanted to admit. "Friend?" he repeated, and the skepticism was obvious in every syllable. "Naomi, Carr." Now, there was something in the way he said it, in the desperate intensity behind the coldness, that made me give in even when every rational fiber of my being screamed for me to stay and finish my dinner. "Okay," I said, picking up my purse with mechanical movements. "Marcel, I'm sorry. We'll continue this conversation later, I promise. Call me." Marcel still looked confused and worried, looking from me to Lucian as if trying to decide whether he should interfere or not. "Okay? Are you sure? Call me when you get home." I just nodded, and then followed Lucian out of the restaurant, feeling everyone's eyes in the room watching us as we left. His car was parked in front, a black and luxurious sedan that matched his controlled and expensive personality perfectly, and he opened the passenger door for me with abrupt movements, before circling around and getting in on the driver's side. The silence inside the car was so dense, I could feel its weight on my shoulders, crushing and loaded with unspoken tension. Lucian drove with his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white, jaw locked, and eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if he were fighting an internal war. I couldn't see but could feel in the electrified atmosphere around us. "What was that?" I finally exploded, because the silence was suffocating me, and anger was beginning to supplant the initial shock. "You embarrassed me. You dragged me out of the restaurant like I was a disobedient child." "Who is he?" Lucian asked, completely ignoring my accusation, his voice coming out low and dangerous. "I already told you," I replied, raising my voice because the frustration was overflowing after months of being repressed. "Childhood friend. Marcel has been my friend since we were kids." "Friend you touch," Lucian said, and there was something raw and exposed in his voice now, something that sounded dangerously close to real jealousy. "That you laugh with. Look at him like—" He stopped abruptly, as if he had realized he was revealing too much. "Like what?" I pressed him, turning in my seat to face him even though he refused to look at me. "He's my friend, and even if he wasn't, you have no right to do this. You told me, remember? This is business, not love. Those were your exact words. So you have no right to show up at my dinner and drag me out like you own me." Lucian stepped on the brake so hard, the car skidded slightly before stopping completely on the shoulder of the empty road. He turned to me, and the intensity in his gaze was something I had never seen before, something wild and desperate behind the control that was clearly unraveling. "I remember," he said, and his voice was hoarse in a way that made something in me respond involuntarily. And maybe I was wrong. The world stopped. I blinked, trying to process those words I never expected to hear coming from Lucian Bianchi's mouth. "What?" He ran his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration that was completely out of character for the controlled persona he always maintained, and the internal struggle was visible in every line of his face. "Seeing you with him," he began, and each word seemed to be forcibly extracted. "Laughing, touching him, happy in a way you never are with me. He took a deep breath. as if preparing to jump off a cliff. I didn't like it, and I don't know why. My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Lucian," I said, and my voice came out softer than I intended, loaded with something dangerous and full of hope. "Are you jealous?" He didn't respond with words, but his jaw locked, and his eyes looked away, and that was confirmation enough. That eloquent silence that said everything he refused to admit out loud. "You have no right to be jealous," I said, and tears threatened to rise because it was all so confusing and painful and intense at the same time. "You keep me at a distance, separate rooms, never touch me. Remember that? And now, when I finally go out and have a friend, when I finally really laugh for the first time in months, you freak out." "I know," Lucian admitted, and his voice was so low I could barely hear it. "I know I have no right, but..." He finally looked at me, and there was so much raw emotion in those dark eyes that my breath failed. "I can't see you with another man, Naomi, even knowing I don't give you any reason to stay, even knowing I'm the worst kind of hypocrite. So what do you want from me?" I asked, and the tears finally fell because it was too much. All of it was too much to handle. "What do you want, Lucian? Because I can't take living in this limbo anymore where you don't want me but you also don't want anyone else to have me." The silence that followed was heavy and painful, filled only with the sound of our ragged breathing. Lucian opened his mouth as if to answer, but then closed it again, and I saw the truth there, clear as crystal. He didn't know. He didn't know what he wanted, didn't know how to name or categorize me, didn't know how to deal with what he was feeling. "Take me home," I finally said, too tired to continue this conversation that wasn't going to lead anywhere. "Please." Lucian started driving again in silence, and I looked out the window trying to control the tears that continued falling silently. But something had changed that night. Something fundamental and irreversible. The walls Lucian had built so carefully around us had cracks now, and through those cracks, something dangerous and exciting was beginning to leak, and neither of us knew yet how impossible it would be to try to hold it back. Lucian is going to need to make up his mind, and he's going to need to decide fast. Chapter 4: Confrontation and Burning Tension.
I can't control this.
The days that followed that night at the restaurant were a form of torture I didn't know existed, a constant and impossible tension that permeated every corner of the mansion and transformed even the most mundane moments into something charged with unresolved electricity. Lucian hadn't gone back to his absurd work hours, which meant that now, for the first time in months, I actually saw him during the day, crossed paths with him in the hallways, felt his presence in the house in a way that was both disturbing and addictive. But the difference now was that he watched me, constantly. I felt the weight of those dark eyes on me when I had breakfast, when I worked on his documents in the library, when I simply crossed the room to get a book. They were looks that lasted a few seconds longer than appropriate, loaded with something I couldn't name but that made my skin tingle and my heart race in ways I knew were dangerous. I tried to ignore it, pretended I didn't feel that constant attention burning into me as if he were trying to decipher a code I didn't even know I carried. But it was impossible to ignore completely when every time I raised my eyes, there he was, watching with that silent intensity that seemed to penetrate through all the defenses I had built around my wounded heart. It was silent jealousy, undeclared possessiveness, and something deeper that neither of us was ready to name out loud. On the 5th night after the incident with Marcel, I was in the library trying to concentrate on a book that normally would hold my attention for hours. But the words danced on the page, making no sense at all, because my mind was completely occupied processing the seismic shift that was happening between me and the man who was technically my husband, but who until recently was practically an elegant and cold stranger living in the same house as me. I heard the footsteps before I saw him, that characteristic sound of expensive shoes against polished marble that I had learned to recognize instantly after months of paying attention to every sign of his presence. My heart accelerated involuntarily, a Pavlovian response I hated, and at the same time couldn't control. And I forced my eyes to remain fixed on the book, even when I felt him enter the library and stop near the door. "We need to talk." Lucian's voice cut through the silence, deep and controlled as always, but there was an underlying current of tension that wasn't there before, something that suggested that control was costing more effort than he wanted to admit. I didn't even lift my eyes from the book, even though the words on the page were just meaningless blurs now. "About?" I asked with a studied indifference I didn't feel at all, keeping my voice firm and distant, because if I showed how much his presence affected me, I would lose any advantage I still had in this impossible situation. "About him," Lucian said after a brief pause. "Marcel." It was as if someone had pulled an invisible thread inside me, making all the false calm instantly unravel. I closed the book harder than necessary, the sound echoing through the silent library, and finally raised my eyes to face him with all the accumulated irritation of the last few days. "He's gay, Lucian," I said, enunciating each word clearly as if I were speaking to someone particularly obtuse. "Engaged. To a man named Luca, so your ridiculous jealousy and your invasion of my dinner? Completely unnecessary and embarrassing." Seeing Lucian's expression change was almost comical, if the situation weren't so frustrating and emotionally exhausting. He stood completely still for several seconds, processing that information, and I could see the war happening behind those dark eyes, something between genuine relief and deep shame for what he had done. "He's gay," Lucian repeated, as if he needed to hear it again to really believe it. "Yes!" I practically yelled, getting up from the comfortable armchair where I was reading because staying seated while we discussed this felt wrong somehow. "But you didn't ask. You didn't bother to simply ask who he was or what he meant to me. You just assumed the worst and dragged me out of that restaurant like I was your property." Lucian took a step toward me, and there was something different in his posture now, something between shame and determination that I couldn't completely categorize. "I didn't know," he said, and his voice was lower now, almost vulnerable in a way I had never heard before. "Because you don't know me." The words exploded from me, loaded with months of accumulated frustration and loneliness. "We're married, Lucian. Married. And you know nothing about me, my friends, my life, my hopes, my fears, nothing, because you never wanted to know. You keep me at this safe distance where you don't have to worry about actually seeing me as a person." I was walking toward the door now, ready to get out of there, before the tears that threatened to fall finally fell. "So, don't come with jealousy now. Not when you spent months making it clear to me that I was just an inconvenient obligation." But before I could reach the door, before I could escape to the safety of my room where I could process all of this alone, Lucian moved with a speed that surprised me, and suddenly he was in front of me, his hand wrapping around my wrist gently but absolutely firmly. Not hurting, but making it clear he wasn't going to let me go. "Not yet. I want to," he said, and there was an intensity in his voice that made my heart stop for a second before it started beating again in an accelerated and erratic rhythm. "What?" I asked, looking at where his hand held my wrist, and then at his face, confused and scared by the sudden proximity, by the heat emanating from him, by the smell of expensive cologne mixed with something essentially masculine that made my head spin. Lucian took another step toward me, eliminating the space that still existed between us, and suddenly he was dangerously close. So close I could see the golden flecks in his dark eyes, could feel the heat from his body through our clothes, could hear the slightly accelerated breathing that matched mine. "No," he said, and each word seemed loaded with weight and meaning that went far beyond the obvious. "About you, everything, every detail, every story, everything that makes you happy or sad or angry." He paused, and I could see the internal struggle happening, could see the man who had built such high walls fighting against the impulse to finally tear them down. "I was an idiot," he continued, his voice becoming hoarse in a way that made something in me respond involuntarily. "For months, keeping my distance, thinking that if I controlled everything, if I kept you far enough away, I'd be safe. But seeing you with him, seeing you laughing and happy in a way you never are with me." Lucian stopped talking and pulled me slightly by the wrist he still held, bringing my hand to his chest, where I could feel his heart beating strong and fast under the expensive fabric of his shirt. "Made me realize I don't control anything," he admitted, with a vulnerability I never expected to hear from him. "Especially what I feel for you." My breath failed completely, trapped somewhere between my throat and my lungs, and I could barely process what was happening because it was all too intense, too fast, too different from everything that had come before. "And what do you feel?" I asked, and my voice came out as a trembling whisper, loaded with dangerous hope and fear of being disappointed once again. Lucian released my wrist only to bring both hands to my face, holding it with a gentleness that contrasted completely with the intensity in his gaze, and then he tilted his head until his forehead was touching mine, our noses almost touching, our breaths mixing in the minimal space that still existed between us. The intimacy of the gesture was overwhelming, more intimate than any kiss we had shared so far, and I felt my entire body respond in ways I didn't even know were possible. "I can't name it yet," he admitted in a low voice, hoarse, loaded with raw emotion he clearly didn't know how to process. "But it's intense, scary, and completely inevitable, no matter how much I try to fight against it." My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could feel it through the palms that still held my face, and when I spoke, my voice was as shaky as the rest of me. "Lucian." But before I could finish the thought, before I could say anything else that needed to be said, he started to tilt his face that last centimeter that separated us, and I saw the intention in his eyes, saw the exact moment he decided to finally close that distance distance he himself had created and maintained for so long. My eyes started to close instinctively, my entire body tense with anticipation, every nerve lit up and waiting for that first real touch of his lips on mine. And I could feel the heat radiating between us, could feel the moment stretching like elastic about to snap. But then, when our lips were millimeters apart, so close I could feel the ghost of the touch that was about to happen, Lucian froze, completely, as if someone had pressed pause on a movie, and I felt the change immediately, felt the moment being destroyed before it even really happened. He pulled away so abruptly I almost lost my balance, and suddenly there was too much space between us again. Cold air where before there had been only heat and proximity and promise of something more. His hands fell from my face as if I were burning, and when I looked up confused and hurt, I saw genuine panic in his eyes, that kind of panic from someone who had gone too far and too fast, and now didn't know how to deal with the consequences. "Sorry," he said, and his voice was rough and broken in a way I had never heard before. I shouldn't have." He ran his hands through his hair in a gesture of total frustration, destroying the always perfect hairstyle, and then, before I could say anything, before I could process what had just happened, and what had almost happened, he turned and left the library with quick steps that bordered on desperate flight. And I stood there, alone again in the silent library, trembling from head to toe with a confused mixture of unsatisfied desire, deep frustration, and something that could be hope, but I was too afraid to name. My fingers automatically went to my lips, touching where his kiss should have landed but never did, and I felt the tears finally fall, because it was all so confusing and intense and painful. He had almost kissed me, had admitted he felt something for me, something he couldn't control or name, but that was real enough to make him cross all those months of self-imposed distance. But at the last second, when it finally seemed like those impossible walls were crumbling, he had run away again, leaving me there with my heart racing and my soul bleeding in ways I didn't know were possible. And the worst part, the part that really destroyed me, was that despite everything, despite the repeated rejection and constant pain, I still wanted that impossible man, still wanted him to come back, to finally stop running, to finally let those walls fall completely and let me in where no one else had permission to go. But as long as Lucian Bianchi remained afraid of his own feelings, as long as he continued seeing vulnerability as weakness and love as danger, I knew this was going to continue being this impossible dance between almost touching and pulling away at the last second. And I didn't know how much longer I could take it before I finally broke completely. Chapter 5. Fiorella's Flashbacks.
I'm afraid to love.
The day after the almost kiss in the library was strange, in a way I couldn't completely categorize, as if the mansion's atmosphere had changed in some fundamental way overnight, and now everything was charged with a tense expectation that made my stomach turn, and my heart beat irregularly whenever I thought about Lucien, and that interrupted moment that still pulsed between us like an open wound. I barely saw him during the day, just quick glimpses when he crossed the hallway toward his office, or when I heard his voice on the phone speaking rapid Italian about business I didn't fully understand. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't see while I tried to keep myself busy with books and documents I couldn't really process, was that Lucian was waging his own internal war in the confines of his office, surrounded by papers that should demand his attention, but might as well be written in alien languages, for how much sense they made to him at that moment. He was sitting in the expensive leather chair behind the mahogany desk that had belonged to his father, looking at the computer without really seeing anything on the screen, because his mind was miles away, lost in memories he had spent years trying to bury so deep he would never have to deal with them again. And then, without permission, and without warning, the flashback came like a wave impossible to resist, dragging him back in time to a moment he thought he had forgotten, but that had always been there, engraved somewhere deep in his psyche, where the most important and painful things always hide. Suddenly he was 9 years old again, small and full of restless energy, running through the huge kitchen of the mansion where he grew up, while the smell of homemade tomato sauce filled the air in a way that made his stomach rumble and his heart feel warm and safe. His mother, Fiorella, was standing at the stove with a flowered apron tied around her waist, dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, humming an old Italian song while she stirred the sauce with a wooden spoon that had stains from decades of loving use. "Lucian," she called without even turning, because mothers always know when their children are near, always sense that specific presence only children bring. "Come taste." He ran to her with the carefree confidence of someone who hadn't yet known real loss or pain, and Fiorella crouched down to his height, offering the spoon with that smile that lit up her entire face and made her eyes shine with that kind of unconditional love only mothers can fully manifest. "What is it, Mama?" "My special sauce," she replied with evident pride, watching attentively as he tasted it, and his eyes widened with genuine pleasure. "Opinion? Perfect," Lucian declared with the brutal honesty of children who haven't yet learned to lie to spare feelings. "Like always." Fiorella laughed in that musical way that made it seem like the whole world was a good and safe place, and then pulled him into a tight hug that smelled of tomatoes and spices and maternal love. "One day you'll cook like this," she said, kissing the top of his head repeatedly, "for someone you love. You'll make this sauce for the special person who'll conquer your heart." Lucian pulled back slightly, looking at her with that innocent curiosity only children have about the mysterious future awaiting them. "I'm going to love someone?" he asked, as if that were something too strange and distant to imagine. "Like Papa loves you?" Fiorella held his face in her hands with such tenderness that even now, more than 20 years later sitting in that office, Lucian could still feel the ghost of that touch. "Yes, tesoro," she said with absolute certainty, with that maternal confidence that makes it seem like she can see the future and knows everything will be okay. "And when you love, when you find that person who makes your heart beat faster, don't be afraid. Love is strength, not weakness. Understand?" "I understand, Mama," little Lucian had replied, even without really understanding, even without having any idea that those words would one day come back to haunt him in ways he could never predict. The memory changed abruptly, as traumatic memories always do, jumping without smooth transition to the worst day of his life. That day that divided his existence into a clear before and after that would never fully reconcile. Lucian was at the hospital, still 9 but about to turn 10 in a few weeks, sitting in a hard plastic chair in the sterile hallway that smelled of disinfectant and despair, watching doctors and nurses run back and forth with expressions that said everything he was afraid to know. There had been a car accident. Simple as that. As banal and common as accidents happen every day all over the world. But this one had taken his mother from him in such a sudden and violent way that his child's brain couldn't fully process it. And now she was dying, and there was nothing money or power or connections could do to change that, because death doesn't negotiate and doesn't accept bribes. When they finally let him into the room, Lucian saw something that would break any child. His father, the powerful and always controlled Don, was openly crying while holding Fiorella's hand, tears running down his face without shame or attempt to hide because pain of that magnitude cannot be hidden or controlled. And his mother was in the hospital bed connected to machines that beeped and hummed, her face too pale, the eyes that always sparkled now dimmed, but still trying to maintain that maternal strength until the last second. "Tesoro," Fiorella called when she saw him, her voice weak and brittle, but still loaded with that unconditional love that not even death could completely erase. "Come here." Lucian approached with trembling steps, terrified in a way children shouldn't know, and Fiorella extended her free hand, the one that wasn't being crushed in his father's desperate grip. When he held that hand that was already getting cold, she pulled him closer, using the last strength that remained to say the last words he would hear from her. "Remember, tesoro," she whispered, and each word cost a visible effort that made his heart bleed in ways he didn't know were possible. "Love is strength, not fear. Always, always choose love." She paused to breathe, the sound hoarse and painful. "Don't let fear win." And then she closed her eyes for the last time, and the machine started beeping in that shrill way that means someone is leaving, and his father completely broke down right there, sobbing in a way Lucian had never seen an adult do, and that scared him almost as much as losing his mother. And there, in that cold and sterile hospital room, something inside little Lucian broke irreparably, and he made an unconscious but fundamental decision. He would never cry again, would never again allow emotions to control him that way, because pain of that magnitude was unbearable, and he preferred to feel nothing than risk feeling that again. The years that followed transformed that childish decision into an ingrained way of life. His father, who before the accident had been loving and present despite the responsibilities of his position, became an empty shell of who he had been. A cold and distant man who functioned only to work and maintain appearances, but who had clearly died along with Fiorella that day at the hospital. And the lessons he passed on to Lucian were the complete opposite of everything Fiorella had taught during the few years they had together. "Love is weakness," his father said repeatedly, like a dark mantra that replaced his mother's lullabies. "Your mother died, and I almost died with her. You saw what love does to people, Lucian. It destroys, it ruins, it makes you vulnerable." He looked at his son with empty, dead eyes. "Never feel, Lucian. Control everything. Always. Emotions are for the weak, and we are not weak." And Lucian, still a child, and desperate for some kind of guidance in a world that had lost all color and warmth, believed. He internalized that toxic philosophy and transformed it into his identity, building walls so high around his heart that he genuinely believed he was incapable of love, believed that part of him had died along with Fiorella and would never return. Relationships became transactional, intimacy was mechanical, and without emotional involvement, and he took pride in that absolute control, in that ability to never be affected or touched by anything or anyone. Until Naomi. The flashback dissolved as abruptly as it had begun, throwing Lucian back to the present with enough force to make him gasp as if he had run a marathon. He was back in the office, his hands trembling slightly where they rested on the desk, and for the first time in more than 20 years, genuine tears were running down his face without permission or control. It was liberating and terrifying at the same time. That silent crying that carried decades of repressed pain and unprocessed grief. Mama was right, Lucian whispered to the empty office, his voice broken and hoarse with emotion he had denied for too long. Love isn't weakness. Never was. I'm the one who's afraid to feel, afraid to lose, afraid of ending up like Papa, destroyed and empty if something happens to the person I love. He ran his hands over his face, wiping away tears with abrupt movements, but they kept coming, refusing to stop now that the dam had finally broken. But Naomi, he continued talking to himself because he needed to hear it out loud, needed to admit it to the universe, even if he couldn't yet admit it to her. She makes me want to risk it, makes me want to try, even knowing it might hurt, that I might lose, that it's a huge risk, and that terrifies me more than anything I've ever faced. The decision formed there, in that moment of raw vulnerability and brutal honesty with himself. He couldn't keep living in fear, couldn't keep keeping Naomi at a distance because he was terrified of what feeling for her meant. His mother had said to choose love instead of fear, and although it had taken more than 2 decades, he was finally ready to try to honor that last request of hers. When night fell, and the mansion became quiet, except for the normal sounds of a large house breathing and settling, Lucian found himself standing in front of Naomi's bedroom door for the second time since they got married, but this time with completely different intention. His hand trembled slightly when he raised it to knock, and for a second he almost gave up, almost ran back to the safety of his own room where he didn't have to be vulnerable or honest or real. But then he thought of Fiorella, of how sad she would have been seeing what he had become, and found the courage to finally knock 3 times on the dark wooden door. "Come in," Naomi's voice came from inside after a few seconds, and there was surprise in that tone because nobody knocked on her door at that hour, especially not him. Lucian opened the door slowly and entered, closing it behind him with a soft click that seemed final and irreversible somehow. Naomi was sitting on the bed with a book in her lap, wearing simple but pretty pajamas, hair loose around her shoulders. And when she saw him standing there uncomfortably close to the door, her eyes widened with a mixture of surprise and something that could be hope, but that she was clearly trying to repress. "Lucian?" she said, marking the page of the book and putting it aside, full attention on him now. "It's almost midnight." "What?" "I know," he interrupted her before losing the courage he had gathered with so much effort. "Sorry to show up like this, but I need to talk to you. Can I come in? Really come in, I mean. Sit down?" Naomi hesitated for just a second, and he saw the exact moment she decided to give him another chance, decided to hear what he had to say even after all the times he had run away, and hurt, and rejected. "Okay," she finally said, moving to make room on the edge of the bed. "Come in." Lucian crossed the room with steps that seemed harder than walking a few meters should be, and then sat on the edge of her bed, keeping a respectful distance, but for the first time really being there, really sharing that space that had been forbidden territory since the wedding. His hands were visibly trembling now, and he interlaced them in his lap, trying to control that obvious sign of nervousness. "I need to tell you something," he began, forcing the words out, even when every instinct screamed for him to run back behind those safe walls, "about why I am this way, cold, distant, why I'm so afraid to feel anything real." Naomi said nothing, just watched him with those expressive brown eyes, waiting patiently for him to continue in his own time. And that patience, that willingness to listen even after everything, made something in his chest tighten painfully. "My mother, Fiorella," Lucian continued, and just speaking her name out loud after so many years making a point of never mentioning it, made the tears threaten to return. "She was everything I'm not. Loving, warm, full of life and warmth and joy. She sang while she cooked, laughed easily, hugged too tight and kissed constantly. She was the sun of our family, you know? And she always said love was strength, not weakness. That when I found someone to love, I shouldn't be afraid." He paused, breathing deeply because the next part was the hardest, the one he had never told anyone because talking about it made it too real, too painful. "She died when I was 10, car accident, sudden, violent, And I was there at the hospital when she died, saw my father completely destroy himself, saw a strong and powerful man crumble because he had lost the love of his life. Naomi's tears started falling silently, but she said nothing, just kept listening while she gripped her own hands tightly, as if she needed to hold herself to keep from reaching for him. After that, my father changed completely, Lucian continued, the words flowing more easily now that he had started, as if a dam had broken, and there was no way to stop the flood anymore. He became cold, empty, just a shell functioning on autopilot, and he taught me that love was dangerous, that feeling was weakness, that I should never allow myself to love someone because the pain of losing was too unbearable. His voice broke slightly. So I learned. I built walls, never let anyone close enough to matter, and it worked for years. I thought I was fine, that I had everything under control. Finally, he looked directly at her and let Naomi see everything, all the pain and fear and vulnerability he had hidden for decades. And then you. A marriage I thought would be just business, just another transaction without emotional involvement. But you're like my mother was, warm where I'm cold, alive where I'm controlled, real in ways that scare me deeply. And that terrifies me, Naomi, because if I allow myself to truly love you, if I tear down these walls and let you in completely, and then lose you, like my father lost my mother, his voice failed completely. I don't know if I'd survive. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion, and then Naomi finally moved, sliding across the bed until she was close enough to take his trembling hands between hers, holding them firmly and warmly. Lucian, she said softly, her voice wet with tears but firm with conviction, you can't live in fear of losing, because if you live like that, you never really live. You just exist. Just function, but you don't truly live. She squeezed his hands, forcing him to really listen, really absorb what she was saying. And I understand the fear. I understand why you built these walls. But I want to live, Lucian. I want to truly live. And I want to live with you. Not just exist in the same house as you. But for that, I need you to try. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have all the answers or never be afraid. You just have to try. Try to be open. Try to be vulnerable. Try to let me in. Lucian looked at where their hands were intertwined, and for the first time realized he hadn't pulled away, hadn't created distance, was allowing that touch and that closeness without running. I don't know how, he admitted with brutal honesty. To be open, to be vulnerable. It's been so long since I felt this that I don't even know where to start. Learn, Naomi said, with that gentle strength that was essentially hers. With me, slowly, one day at a time. And Lucian? She waited until he looked in her eyes. You can touch me, always, anytime. I want you to touch me. Don't be afraid of me. Never be afraid of me. Something in him broke completely with those words, with that permission and acceptance and unspoken love that was there in every syllable, and before he could think, or rationalize, or build defenses again, Lucian pulled her into a desperate and tight hug, burying his face in her neck while finally allowing those walls to crumble at least a little. Naomi reciprocated immediately, her arms around him with equal strength, and he felt her tears wetting his shirt, but it didn't matter because his own tears were falling silently as he allowed himself that moment of complete vulnerability. Sorry, he whispered against her hair, his voice broken and hoarse, for all those cold months, for hurting you repeatedly, for being so afraid that I rejected you when all you did was try. I forgive you, Naomi replied without hesitation, her hands stroking his back in slow and comforting circles. If you promise you'll try, really try. I promise, Lucian said, and each word was a sacred oath he intended to keep. I'll try. And Naomi, I think I love you. I'm not sure yet. I don't know how this works or how to name what I feel, but it's something strong and scary and completely out of my control, and I want to explore this with you, if you'll let me. Naomi pulled back just enough to look at his face, and the smile that crossed her tear-wet face was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. It's a start, she said, her voice full of genuine hope. A good start. And there, embracing on her bed in a comfortable silence neither of them wanted to break, something fundamental changed between them. The walls were still there, but there were cracks now, openings where light and warmth could pass through, and for the first time since Fiorella died, Lucian allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his mother had been right all along. Love was strength, and he was finally ready to be strong. For someone who started the story saying he had no feelings, Lucian declares himself pretty well. Chapter 6. Cute Moments and Possessive Jealousy.
You're mine tonight.
The week that followed that night in my room, when Lucian finally opened up and let me see the wounds he'd carried since childhood, was different from everything that had come before, in a way that left me constantly in a state of amazed surprise and a little nervousness. Because Lucian was trying, really trying in awkward and sometimes comical ways, but genuine in a way that made my heart melt with every small gesture that showed how much that man was fighting against decades of conditioning to be different, to be better, to be present. The first evidence of this came on a Thursday morning, when I came down the stairs yawning and still half asleep, expecting to find the mansion silent as always, because Lucien was normally already in his office for hours by that time of day. But when I got near the kitchen, the strange smell of something burning made me stop at the door with my eyes wide in absolute shock at the scene unfolding in front of me. Lucien Bianchi, powerful Don and always impeccably controlled, was standing at the stove wearing a white shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows and an expression of intense concentration on his face as he looked at a coffee maker that was making threatening noises and toast that was definitely beyond the point of being considered edible. There was smoke coming from the toaster, and he was looking at it with a mixture of confusion and frustration that would have been funny if it weren't so incredibly adorable. "Lucien," I said, and my voice came out loaded with surprise and barely contained amusement. "Are you cooking?" He turned immediately at the sound of my voice, and I saw the exact moment shame and something like embarrassment passed across that normally so controlled face. "I tried to make coffee," he admitted, pointing at the coffee maker as if that explained everything, "and toast." But he gestured to the completely carbonized bread slices in the toaster. "I'm not very good at this, apparently." I couldn't hold back the laugh that exploded from me, genuine and joyful, and the way his face became even more embarrassed only made me laugh harder. "You burned toast," I managed to say between laughs, approaching to get a better look at the disaster. "How did you manage to burn toast? It's literally just putting bread in the toaster and waiting." Lucien ran his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration that was already becoming familiar, messing up the always perfect hairstyle in a way that made him look younger and more accessible. "I got distracted," he defended himself, and there was an almost petulant tone in his voice that was completely different from the always serious Don I knew. "Thinking about..." He stopped abruptly, realizing what he was about to say, and then continued anyway with slightly flushed cheeks. "About you." My heart did that weird thing of jumping and melting at the same time, and before I could think better or rationalize or protect myself, I leaned in and kissed his cheek quickly. A soft and quick touch, but loaded with all the affection that was growing inside me in ways I could no longer deny or control. "That was the cutest breakfast attempt I've ever seen," I said softly, still close enough to feel the heat radiating from him. Lucien froze completely, as still as a statue, and I realized with a shock of tenderness that this had been the first kiss I gave him voluntarily, the first time I initiated physical contact, without it being in response to something he had done first. And by the expression on his face, that simple kiss on the cheek had affected him more than anything more elaborate could have. "Come on," I said, taking his hand and pulling him gently away from the stove before he could cause more damage. "I'll make the coffee. You watch and learn, because if we're going to depend on your culinary skills, we'll die of starvation or food poisoning." The laugh that came from him was rare and beautiful, that deep and genuine sound I had heard maybe 3 times in all the months we'd been married, and hearing it again made something in me calm down and warm up at the same time. "Okay," he agreed, the smile still playing on his lips in a way that completely transformed his face. "I'll learn." And then we spent the next hour in the kitchen, me teaching the most basic things about how to make coffee without exploding the coffee maker, and how to toast bread without turning it into charcoal, and him trying to follow instructions with a comical seriousness that made it seem like he was learning complex military tactics instead of simple household tasks. When he inevitably messed something up, I would laugh and he would smile with that embarrassed but happy expression, and there was a lightness between us that I had never experienced before, an ease that made everything seem possible. The second big change came a few days later, when Lucien mentioned casually during dinner, as if it weren't something monumental, that we had been invited to an important charity gala, and he would like me to accompany him. It wasn't presented as an order or obligation, but as a genuine request, and the difference was so significant. I almost spilled the wine I was drinking. "I'd love to go," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual even when my heart was racing at the prospect of finally appearing in public with him for real, not just as a facade wife, but as a real partner he actually wanted by his side. And now here I was, standing in front of the mirror in my room wearing a gold dress I had bought specifically for that night, a design that hugged every curve before falling into a flowing skirt that sparkled when I moved, making it look like I was wrapped in liquid light. I had done my makeup with extra care, eyes lined with that perfect smoky look that made the browns seem deeper, and my hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, but with a few loose strands framing my face purposefully. When I came down the stairs and found Lucien waiting in the entrance hall, already impeccable in the black tuxedo that fit his body in a way that should be illegal, the way he stopped completely and just looked at me with that intensity that was already becoming familiar made my stomach flip and my skin heat up. "You look incredible," he said, after several seconds of loaded silence, and his voice was hoarse in that way that made interesting things happen in my entire body. I smiled, feeling my cheeks heat with the sincere compliment, and the novelty of it, of being seen and appreciated by my own husband, was still surreal enough to leave me a little dizzy. "Thank you. You look very handsome too." I paused, gathering courage for the next part. "May I?" I extended my hand in a clear offer, giving him the option to accept or refuse. Lucian looked at my extended hand for a second that seemed to stretch, and then something passed across his face, something between determination and relief, and he took my hand with firmness and warmth. "Always," he said, and there was weight in that single word. "You always can. Touch whenever you want. Wherever you want. I'll never push you away again." And then we left the mansion holding hands, and when we got in the car, and then into the gala packed with powerful and influential people, we were still holding hands, and I could feel the curious and surprised looks, because everyone knew our marriage had been a cold arrangement, and everyone expected to see professional distance, not this obvious intimacy that was radiating from us now. The night was going surprisingly well, with Lucian introducing me to associates and business partners, with his hand possessively on my waist, including me in conversations instead of treating me like a decorative accessory, when one of his associates, a middle-aged man with eyes that lingered too long on my dress's neckline, approached with a smile that instantly made me uncomfortable. "Lucian," the man said with false cordiality, "your wife is absolutely radiant tonight. You're a lucky man." I felt Lucian's arm around my waist tighten slightly, pulling me almost imperceptibly closer against his side, and when I looked at his face, I saw that locked jaw I already recognized as a sign that something had awakened his possessive instincts. "Yes," Lucian replied, and his voice was ice-cold but vibrating with barely contained emotion. "My wife. Mine." The emphasis on the word was impossible to miss, a clear territorial marking that made something in me heat up in ways it probably shouldn't, but that I couldn't help, because there was something primitively satisfying about being claimed that way by a man who had spent months keeping me at a distance. The associate, apparently oblivious or simply too stupid to read the room, continued. "I was wondering if I could ask for a dance later. With your permission, of course." The temperature around me seemed to drop several degrees, and I felt Lucian tense in a way that bordered on dangerous. "No," he said with a brutal simplicity that left no room for negotiation. The associate blinked, clearly surprised by the direct refusal. "Excuse me? She doesn't dance," Lucian elaborated, and each word was covered in sharp ice. "With others. Only with me." "Problem?" The man visibly backed away, finally realizing he had stepped on very clearly marked territory. No problem." And then he basically fled, disappearing into the crowd with hurried steps. I turned to look at Lucian, trying to decide if I should be irritated by the possessiveness or secretly flattered, and ended up going with honesty. "You were very possessive just now," I said, but my voice was more amused than reproachful. Lucian looked at me, and there was something wild and not totally controlled in those dark eyes that made my breath fail. "I know," he admitted without a hint of regret. "Sorry, I shouldn't. I didn't say I didn't like it." I interrupted him before he could start building walls again, and I saw the exact moment those words hit him, when something lit up in that already intense gaze. He leaned in slightly, his mouth dangerously close to my ear, and his voice was low and hoarse when he asked, "You like it when I'm possessive?" My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could feel it through the hand that still rested on my waist. "Maybe," I admitted with dangerous honesty. "A little. When it's not toxic, when it's just protective and jealous in that way that shows you really care." Lucian pulled me even closer, eliminating any space that still existed between our bodies, and the smile that curved his lips was something between promising and dangerous. "Then you're going to love what comes next," he said against my ear, making shivers run down my spine. "Because I'm not going to let any man here look at you tonight without consequences." My breathing was completely irregular now, and when I managed to make my voice work again, it came out shaky and curious. "What kind of consequences?" "You'll find out," he promised, his lips almost touching my ear in a way that was doing impossible things to my rational thinking capacity. "Later, when I take you home, and finally break the last distance that still exists between us." Before I could fully process that loaded promise, before I could ask exactly what he meant by breaking the last distance, the music changed to something slow and romantic, and Lucian extended his hand with that natural elegance of his. "Dance with me?" I put my hand in his without hesitation, and he guided me to the dance floor where other couples were already moving in slow circles. When he pulled me close, one hand on my waist, and the other holding my hand, we were pressed together in a way that left absolutely no space between our bodies, and the intimacy of it was stunning. "You've never danced with me before," I said softly, as we moved together with with surprising synchronicity, as if we had practiced this 1,000 times when in reality it was the first. Because I was afraid, Lucian admitted with that raw honesty that was still new, but that I was beginning to deeply appreciate, of touching you and not being able to stop. And now? I asked, looking directly into those dark eyes that were fixed on me with an intensity that made the rest of the room disappear. Now I don't stop, he replied, spinning me gently before pulling me back against him, even closer if that was possible. Never again. You're mine, Naomi, and I'm yours. And everyone here is going to know it before the night is over. I rested my forehead against his, that gesture that was already becoming ours, intimate and perfect, in ways that bigger gestures could never be. I like this, Lucian, I said honestly, letting him see everything I was feeling. Possessive, open, real, vulnerable but strong. I like him a lot. Good, Lucian said. And then, there in the middle of the dance floor with hundreds of people watching, he kissed my forehead with such tenderness and reverence that I felt tears threaten to rise. Because he's here to stay, forever. And as we danced under the bright lights with curious eyes watching us from all sides, I knew with absolute certainty that something fundamental had changed, that the walls had really fallen this time, and that the man in my arms was no longer the cold and distant Don who had married me out of obligation. He was Lucian, my Lucian, and finally, he was truly mine. Chapter 7. Burning tension and night together.
Stay with me.
The tension in the car during the drive back from the gala was so dense and palpable I could feel its weight on my lungs, making it difficult to breathe in a way that had nothing to do with lack of air, and everything to do with the way Lucian was driving with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on my knee, the casual but absolutely purposeful touch burning through the thin fabric of the gold dress. Neither of us spoke, but the silence was loaded with unspoken promises and anticipation that grew with each block we passed, each traffic light we crossed, each meter that brought us closer to the mansion, and everything that was waiting for us there. I could feel my heart beating so hard I was sure he could hear it, could feel my skin heating under that gaze he cast in my direction every few seconds, intense looks loaded with intention that made my stomach flip and my mouth go dry. When we finally arrived and the car stopped at the mansion's circular entrance, I almost laughed from the relief and nervousness mixed together that exploded in my chest, because the weight was slowly killing me, but at the same time I wasn't sure if I was ready for what was coming next. Lucian got out of the car with controlled but quick movements, and then circled to my side to open the door for me with that old-fashioned chivalry that normally would be just politeness, but now seemed loaded with additional meaning. When I put my hand in his and he helped me out of the car, the way his fingers intertwined with mine and refused to let go even after I was already standing, was a clear declaration of intentions. We entered the silent mansion, the employees already retired to their own quarters, as always happened after 10 at night, and suddenly we were completely alone in that enormous space that normally seemed cold and impersonal, but now seemed too intimate, too small to contain everything that was growing between us. Lucian closed the front door behind us, and the sound of the latch clicking echoed through the entrance hall like something final and irreversible. I turned to face him, trying to maintain some appearance of composure, even when my entire body was vibrating with nervousness and anticipation, and forced my voice to come out steady when I spoke. Lucian, about what you said at the gala, about breaking the last distance between us. But before I could finish the thought, before I could ask exactly what he had meant by that, or give voice to any of the dozens of questions that were piling up in my head, Lucian took 3 determined steps toward me, eliminating the space between us with a speed that made my breath fail completely. And then he was there, dangerously close. So close I could feel the heat radiating from him in waves that made my skin tingle. And suddenly my back was against the hall wall, and he was in front of me with his hands braced on the wall on either side of my head, surrounding me completely without ever really touching me. It wasn't threatening. Nothing about his posture suggested danger or intimidation, but it was intense in a way that made my entire body respond involuntarily, made my heart race, and my breathing become irregular, and my skin heat up as if it were catching fire from the inside out. Lucian looked at me with that intensity that was already becoming familiar but never failed to deeply affect me, and when he lifted one hand from the wall to touch my face with fingers that trembled slightly, I felt that touch echo through my entire body. "I meant," he began, and his voice was hoarse and low in a way that made interesting things happen in my stomach, "that I can't take it anymore. Separate rooms, physical distance, pretending I don't desperately want you, that I don't think about you constantly, that I don't wake up in the middle of the night wishing you were in my arms instead of locked in your room on the other side of the mansion." My breathing was completely irregular now, coming out in small gasps I couldn't control, and when I managed to make my voice work, it came out as a trembling whisper. Then don't pretend. Not anymore. Something lit up in his eyes, something wild and intense that made all the air around us seem electrified. And then he finally closed that last centimeter of distance and kissed me. It was completely different from that mechanical and cold kiss at the wedding, completely different from anything that had come before, because this was real and deep and burning in ways that made my head spin and my knees go weak. His lips moved against mine with an urgency that bordered on desperation, as if he had spent months dying of thirst, and I was the first drop of water he found. I responded with the same intensity, pouring months of frustration and repressed desire and unspoken love into that kiss that seemed to consume everything around us. And my hands automatically went to his hair, messing up that always perfect hairstyle as I pulled him closer as if there was no such thing as close enough. Lucian's hands were everywhere at once, sliding down my waist, up my back, tangling in my hair, and destroying the elegant bun I had taken so long to do. But I didn't care at all because the feeling of those large, warm hands exploring me through the thin fabric of the dress was more important than any hairstyle could be. He kissed a trail from my jaw to my neck, and the sensation of his lips against my sensitive skin there made an involuntary sound escape my throat, something between a sigh and a moan I couldn't hold back. I felt Lucian's smile against my skin, that smug smile I rarely saw but secretly loved. And then he spoke against my neck with that hoarse voice that made my spine tingle. "Tell me you want me," he asked, or ordered, I wasn't sure which. "Like I want you. Desperately. I want you," I admitted without hesitation, because lying at that moment would be impossible and unnecessary when everything I felt was written so clearly in every irregular breath and every accelerated beat of my heart. "I always wanted you, Lucian. From the beginning, even when you were cold and distant and kept me away, even when it hurt. I always wanted you." I paused, gathering courage for the next part, for the words I had kept for so long, afraid he would never be ready to hear them. "I love you, Lucian. I love you so much it sometimes hurts to breathe." Lucian stopped completely, pulling back just enough to look directly in my eyes, and there was something raw and vulnerable in that look that made my heart tighten in my chest. "Say it again," he asked, and his voice was broken with emotion he wasn't trying to hide anymore. "I love you," I said again, firmer this time, letting him see everything, every piece of love that had grown inside me despite all the obstacles and all the reasons to give up. "I love you completely, irrevocably, forever." I saw tears shine in his eyes, and then he was kissing me again, but it was different now, softer but somehow deeper, loaded with all the emotions he was finally allowing himself to feel. When he pulled back, there was a smile on his lips that completely transformed his face, making him look younger and lighter and happier than I had ever seen. "I don't deserve you," he said with absolute conviction. But before I could protest, he continued, "But I love you too, Naomi. So much it scares me, terrifyingly, completely, in ways I didn't even know I was capable of feeling." And then, before I could fully process those words I had waited so long to hear, Lucian picked me up in a fluid movement, one arm under my knees and another on my back, lifting me as if I weighed nothing. I let out a surprised and joyful laugh, my arms automatically going around his neck to steady myself. "What are you doing?" I asked between laughs, even knowing exactly what he was doing, even feeling my heartbeat even faster with the certainty of what was coming next. "Taking you to my room," Lucian replied with absolute determination, starting to climb the wide stairs with firm and sure steps. "Our room, because enough separation, enough distance, enough nights alone when we should be together. You sleep with me tonight, and tomorrow, and every day after that, forever." "About time," I said softly, kissing his jawline as he continued climbing, and I heard the low laugh that vibrated in his chest in response. He stopped in the middle of the stairs to kiss me again, long and deep, and promising everything that was to come. And when we finally reached the top, and he carried me down the hallway toward his room that I had never entered, my heart was so full, it seemed about to explode. Lucian pushed the bedroom door open with his foot, entered, and then set me down slowly, letting me slide down his body in a way that made us both gasp with the friction and proximity. The last thing I saw before he kissed me again and the door closed behind us, blocking out the rest of the world and leaving only the two of us in that intimate and private space, was the smile on his face, that genuine and completely happy smile that was worth every second of waiting and every moment of pain that had preceded that perfect moment. And then there was no more thinking, just sensation and connection and love finally fully manifested. The morning light was filtering through the curtains when I woke up, creating golden patterns that danced on the walls of Lucian's room, our room now, and the first thing I registered was the solid and comforting warmth of his body around me. I was lying on my back with my head on his chest, listening to the firm and steady beat of the heart that now belonged to me as much as mine belonged to him, and his arm was around my waist, holding me close, as if even sleeping he needed to maintain that physical connection. When I moved slightly, feeling muscles protest in ways that made me blush, remembering exactly why they were sore, I realized Lucian was already awake, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my back through the thin fabric of his shirt that I had put on at some point during the night. I raised my eyes and found that dark gaze already fixed on me, and there was something so soft and affectionate in that expression that it made my heart melt completely. "Good morning, Mia Moli," he said softly, his voice still hoarse from sleep, but loaded with so much affection it was impossible not to smile. "My wife." The words in Italian were infinitely more beautiful and meaningful than in Portuguese. "Good morning," I replied, snuggling closer and sighing contentedly when his arms tightened around me. "You're different." "Different how?" he asked, genuine curiosity coloring his tone. "Light," I said, searching for the right word to describe the change I could see so clearly. "Like an enormous weight has been lifted from your shoulders. You look happy, really happy." Lucian was silent for a few moments, those fingers still tracing patterns on my skin in a distracted and comforting way. And when he spoke, his voice was loaded with emotion. "Because I am. For the first time in years, since my mother died, I feel complete, whole. Like a part of me that was missing has finally returned to its place." I pulled back just enough to look at his face, seeing tears shine slightly in the dark eyes. "Your mother, Fiorella," I said softly, bringing a hand to his face to trace his jawline tenderly. "What do you think she would say if she saw you now?" The laugh that escaped him was wet with unhidden emotion, and he blinked a few times to control the tears that threatened to fall. "She would say, 'See, Tesoro, I told you. Love is strength, not weakness. Not fear." He paused, his voice becoming firmer with conviction. "And she would be right. About everything. You made me strong, Naomi. You gave me the courage to finally stop being afraid to truly live." I kissed him softly, a light touch full of love, and when I pulled back, I was smiling through my own tears. "And you made me feel loved. Finally, truly, in the way I always dreamed but never thought I'd have." "Always loved," Lucian promised, rolling to put me underneath him, supporting himself on his elbows so as not to crush me, but close enough that our noses touched. "I promise, Naomi, never cold again, never distant again, just us, together, forever, for all eternity," I repeated, sealing that promise with another kiss that quickly deepened into something more. And as the morning light continued to fill the room, we continued to learn each other, to build that intimacy that had been denied for so long, to finally live the marriage that should have been from the beginning. And for the first time since it all began, I was completely irrevocably happy. Chapter 8. Public Redemption and Sweet Ending.
She is my forever.
A week after that night that changed everything, Lucian casually mentioned during breakfast that we had been invited to another gala, coincidentally at the same venue where it had all begun months ago. I agreed without thinking much about it, still floating in that bubble of newly discovered happiness, where I woke up in his arms every morning and fell asleep with kisses that never seemed enough, no matter how many there were. When we arrived at the elegant and luxurious ballroom, where our first public appearance as a real couple had happened, I had no idea what Lucian had planned. I was just enjoying the way he kept his hand possessively on my waist, how he introduced me with obvious pride, how he looked at me as if I were the most precious thing in the entire world. Then the music stopped abruptly, and I saw Lucian walk onto the stage with determined steps, taking the microphone with that natural confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. My heart raced with confusion and a touch of nervousness as he adjusted the microphone, and the entire ballroom's attention turned to him. "Good evening," he began, and his voice echoed through the silent room. "I know it's unusual to interrupt like this, but I need to say something important, publicly." He paused, his eyes finding mine through the crowd. "A few months ago, in this very place, I said something cruel to my wife. I established cold rules, distance. I said, 'Never touch me.' And today, in front of all of you, I break those rules completely." He extended his hand toward me. "Naomi, come here, please." My legs were shaking as I walked onto the stage, my heart beating so hard I could barely hear the curious whispers around us. When I reached Lucian, he took my hands in his, looking directly into my eyes with a vulnerability that stole my breath. "6 months ago, I married you out of obligation," he said, his voice firm but loaded with emotion. "Alliance between families, and I treated you terribly. I was cold, distant, cruel. I rejected you repeatedly when all you did was try." He squeezed my hands. "But you showed me that love isn't weakness, it's strength, like my mother always said, and I spent years refusing to believe." Tears were already running down my face as he continued. "So today, In front of everyone, I say, touch me, always. In public, in private, always. Because you're not just my wife on paper. You're my love, my life, my reason to finally stop being afraid to truly live. His voice broke slightly. Will you forgive me for all those wasted months and let me make up for it for the rest of our lives? Only if you promise never to run away from us again, I managed to say through the tears. I promise, he said, and then he kissed me right there, long and deep, and completely public, while the entire ballroom applauded, and I heard Mabel's familiar voice shouting, "Finally!" from somewhere in the crowd. Months later, I was in the mansion's kitchen preparing Fiorella's special sauce, following the yellowed and stained recipe that Lucian had kept for years like a precious treasure. I felt strong arms wrap around me from behind, and I smiled when Lucian kissed my neck softly. "What are you doing?" he asked, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Your mother's sauce," I replied, turning slightly to see him. "You gave me the recipe, remember?" I saw emotion shine in his eyes. "She would have loved you," he said softly. "Would have loved everything about you." "I would have loved her too," I said, taking a deep breath before releasing the news I'd been holding all day. "And Lucian, we're going to need an extra room in 8 months." It took a few seconds to process, and then his eyes widened. "You're pregnant?" When I nodded, he spun me around in his arms with a joy so pure it made my heart overflow. "Best surprise," he said, kissing me repeatedly. "You made me the happiest man, husband, and now father. You're going to be an amazing dad," I promised, because you chose love instead of fear, like your mother wanted. A year later, I watched Lucian holding our daughter Paloma with a tenderness that still made me melt. He looked at me with eyes shining with complete happiness. "You freed me," he said softly, "from fear, from coldness. You gave me this, family, love, real life." "We freed each other," I corrected, moving closer to kiss him softly while Paloma babbled between us. And there, in that small and perfect family, Fiorella's legacy continued. Love was strength, not weakness. And finally, Lucian had learned to truly live. Final reflection. The deepest lesson I felt writing this story is that love isn't weakness, it's courage. Lucian spent more than 20 years building emotional walls, believing that protecting himself from feelings would make him strong. But in reality, those walls turned him into a prisoner of his own fear, unable to live fully or experience real connections. The story teaches us that past traumas don't need to dictate our future. Losing someone we love is devastating, but living in fear of loving again doesn't honor who we lost. It only wastes the life we still have. Fiorella said love is strength, and she was right. Lucian only found true strength when he finally had the courage to be vulnerable. Naomi shows us that loving persistence has healthy limits. She didn't give up completely, but she also established that she deserved to be truly loved, not just tolerated. She lived her life, maintained her dignity, and that was crucial. Vulnerability is the most courageous act that exists. Opening your heart, knowing it can be hurt, loving knowing you can lose, living fully even with fear. That's true courage. That's true strength. And if you want to see another deep story, click on the video appearing now on your screen.